Welcome. I'm Stephen Zipperstein. I'm Koshland Professor in Jewish Culture and History at Stanford and Director of the Center for Jewish Studies. Um, Inspiring this event were a series of conversations I had, and also my wife Susan Barron had, with the three participants uh, uh, in a conversation with Bernie Avishai. A few months ago, he expressed, as I recall, some degree of optimism about what might transpire in the wake of the war. Um, Victor Friedman, a good friend of my wife's, expressed in a conversation around the same time more than a modicum of pessimism. And Dahlia, as I recall in a piece in the New York Times, um, um, wrote that inasmuch as all other options have been exhausted, perhaps this crisis might augur new, perhaps previously inconceivable and more creative ones. I hope I don't misquote. The panel is profoundly unrepresentative, culturally, politically, religiously. And it's made up of people who I personally respect and who are all close, attentive, deeply perceptive commentators on Israeli and Palestinian matters. Bernie Avishai writes frequently on Israel and related issues for the New Yorker. He has taught at Dartmouth and elsewhere, and is the author of the widely read, then widely debated, now classic work, The Tragedy of Zionism. Victor Friedman was the first director of Interns for Peace and remains a participant in the Jordan Valley activists that work to protect Palestinian shepherds in the West Bank. He's professor emeritus and founder of the Action Research Center for Justice at the Max Stern Jezreel Valley College. He lives in Zichron. Bernie lives in Jerusalem. Dahlia Scheinlin has advised on 9 national campaigns in Israel and campaigns and elections in 15 other countries. She also holds a PhD from Tel Aviv University and is the author of the just published The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, Promise Unfulfilled. Dahlia lives in Tel Aviv. We're focusing today on one particular, if utterly crucial, aspect of the Israel-Gaza-Palestine conflict, namely the day after. What it is that the panelists think, hope, fear the region will look like once the conflict ends, whatever this might mean. The first question, we'll speak with one another for about an hour, and then open up for discussions with the audience, with questions lodged onto Zoom. Shana Hammerman, the Associate Director of Jewish Studies, will monitor these questions and ask them. What, as you see it, does it mean that the conflict ends? And how do you define that ending? Just open up for the three of you to talk about that.
Well, since you accused me of optimism at one point, maybe I ought to.
It was a moment of optimism, Bertie. You shouldn't feel embarrassed.
I mean, I suppose I should qualify anything I'm about to say, by saying that when it comes to these issues, any analyses we have, any prediction we make is a third dread, a third wishful thinking, and a third fact. So I'll take that as a given. If you're asking about what after the war, it sort of begs the question of what the war is, and what is really being fought out here. On the one hand, obviously there is a Palestinian conflict that's long-standing, of which this war is a part. But the way the war has unfolded, it seems pretty clear that both the problem and the solution is regional, has become increasingly regional. And the engine of war on the other side has more than Hamas involved. Clearly, in Israel too, right now, Israel's kind of shrunken because you have somewhere between 50 and 70,000 people displaced from the northern border because of the potential war with Hezbollah and the ongoing border clashes with Hezbollah. And you have proxies, Iranian proxies around the region, and Jordan certainly isn't feeling very comfortable right now, given the Iranian presence in Iraq. So we have a war that doesn't feel like, even if we get a ceasefire in Gaza that holds a long period of time, I don't feel like the conflict that we are now into ends. But that, ironically, is part of the reason why I saw a source for optimism. Because if you think of the problem as regional, then you can start thinking of the solution as regional. And if you listen to people, particularly people hanging around the INSS, the Institute for National Security Studies, which Dahlia knows well, you begin to hear a consensus building that as this war ends, as this battle, this part of the war ends, in order for the ceasefire to hold, there have to be a number of steps which almost immediately gesture towards regional solution. For example, you cannot have Hamas preempted in Gaza. Let's say we default not to sort of reckless surgery by going into Rafah, but a kind of immunotherapy by developing a kind of consensus among the regional powers, the Sunni regional powers, and the PA, that we have to isolate Hamas and constrict them. That's going to mean closing the Philadelphia corridor on the bottom of the Gaza Strip. That means cooperation with Egypt. That means reinstituting. To get cooperation with Egypt, you have to reinstitute the PA. In order to get the PA administering in the other areas of Gaza, which don't fall back, hopefully, into Hamas's control, you have to have reinforcement of Egyptian, maybe even Jordanian troops. And you immediately have to infuse the area with tremendous amount of investment to rebuild what is a devastated infrastructure. If you have all of these things going, that presupposes Israel buying into some kind of regional plan, which is bubbling up. And every time Blinken gives an interview these days, you can hear it between the lines, not even between the lines sometimes. But that regional plan means Israel has to somehow accept a process leading at some point in the future to a Palestinian state in order to get all of these things lined up, for which Israel gets normalization with Saudi Arabia and gets also a defense pact with America. Like, it all kind of fits in a single package as complex as the Marshall Plan. And I think that the irony is here that there's no piecemeal way of avoiding that regional settlement. In its absence, what you get is a continuing war of attrition. In Gaza, Israel becomes internationally isolated. You have the prospect of war on the north. You have a prospect of a new intifada in the West Bank, all the destabilization of Jordan. I could go on. We know what the horror show looks like. My point is that the way of getting out of this horror show presupposes a regional plan which is already cooking, and which, in my view, Israel can't avoid finally if it wants to avoid the horror show. Why don't I just leave it at that for a moment?
There seems to be a good many pots on the stove cooking. Dahlia, Victor.
I'll be happy to
Yeah.
jump in and try to augment, I think, what Bernie said. I think that if I had to characterize, I think going back to your question about what does an end of the conflict mean, we have so many layers of conflict right now that it can be hard to pick them apart. But I will start with the immediate layer, which is number one, stop the bloodletting. And now this isn't a call for a unilateral ceasefire or a policy prescription about how to get there. But there is a increasingly, sadly, robust school of thought in conflict studies that says that conflict is just the end of the cessation of violence or the absence of violence. And that is a low bar. It's not one that I like, but I think that we are in a situation right now where it has to be understood that this is the first step, especially as it relates to civilians. So I would do a lot now to reach a situation where we stop the bloodletting among civilians. And I'm not thinking about this completely theoretically. I'm looking at other cases where there are lots of problems with how they've resolved the conflicts, but at least they're not still at war. That's a big step ahead. Next, I would say that people in the region, Israelis, who hold the vast political power, need to understand that an unresolved conflict is a formula for permanent cyclical escalation. And so we can't talk about resolving the conflict without resolving the conflict, you know what I mean? Without some sort of a political framework to channel this conflict. I've shifted my own language on this, just naturally, not because I think there's a politically correct way of saying it. Resolving the conflict is a little bit, or calling for peace is strangely disconnected. Nobody really knows what we mean. I think we will always have conflict. It's part of human nature. The point is to channel it into political frameworks and institutions, rather than only ever having military means as our method of communication about the conflict. So that's why I think we need conflict resolution that means that, but let's not expect it to resolve all the issues. And that's kind of my third point. There is a perception that if we can't find the perfect solution to this conflict, one state, two states in a confederated or federation system or something, and I'm very open about which of those I support and think is most realistic, feasible, and desirable. But the bigger problem is that I think that I hear from so many, no matter which kind of political framework for resolution I'm discussing, somebody's always there to say why it won't work. And therefore, the answer seems to be, we can't get to any of them. And I think that this is a very misleading approach to what conflict resolution means. There is no perfect resolution to any conflict, nowhere in the world, not in human society. And too often that's been an excuse not to have any resolution. So I think we have to shift our understanding of what conflict resolution means, not to lower the bar, the opposite, to say, well, we don't need to wait for the perfect form, political framework in order to advance it, because we have a responsibility to do better than we're doing now. So that's my third point. And then I would say that, the fourth point is to then, having gone through those stages, is to really revive our understanding of what the most realistic and and auspicious type of political framework is relevant, and not to be stuck in frameworks of the past that have been developed 25 years ago, which are no longer relevant. And this is where I am going to completely advocate for, looking at the realities of the traditional hard separation-based two-state paradigm as something that is no longer applicable and, in my view, no longer desirable, in favor of two states with a much more organic sense of partnership and built-in institutions for power sharing where needed, which recognize the fact, I think that, any sort of political framework for resolution needs to be based on a few principles. That both nations have the right of self-determination. I think that rather than looking at, this as a security problem, we need to understand this starts from the fact that there are two nations who need self-determination. And I think that the basic principle of equality between those two nations is something that has never truly been internalized. It may sound, obvious to say so, but it's not at all obvious. Certainly not on the Israeli side. I think all peace efforts up until now have not taken into account equality between the two nations as a starting point. It's always been about what levels of Israeli control do we need to supply Israeli security. And that's always been the higher priority than Palestinian self-determination. but it does have to be mutual. I mean, we're not going to get anywhere by assuming that there is self-determination for one side and not the other. And I would go further. I think that the future of a political paradigm or political framework for resolving this needs to accept both individual rights and guarantee them, and collective equality within both states, ideally, so that each group, to the extent that there is going to be some overlap between them, respects the collective national rights of the other side. And I guess the final point I would make is regarding how to reach this approach. And I can only agree with what Bernie has put forward in his intervention in the beginning, which is that the two sides are clearly incapable of doing this on their own. We've tried for too long. Everybody can blame the other for good or bad faith efforts, bad politics, or the wrong policy framework, in my opinion, was part of the problem. But this is not going to happen on its own. The two sides have demonstrated their commitment to enduring levels of failure on the peace process, and we desperately need international support for this to happen.
Victor.
Okay, well, I first of all agree with Bernie and I agree with Dahlia. But I would like to focus in on the actual, when I look forward, when I look ahead, I don't look at whether it's a two-state or the one state or the one land, two states. I think I would personally think all of those are fine. It's the question of how do you get to there? That's really the issue. And it really connects up to what Dahlia said about equality. Because as she pointed out, I think quite well, that in many of the ideas of solutions, but in the negotiation processes that we've had, Israelis and Palestinians, let's talk about Palestinians. Israel has always enjoyed a much stronger position. And if you talk to Palestinians about, they say, well, we can only really come to negotiations with the Israelis from a position of equal power. And that is a major challenge. How can the Palestinians who are under Israeli control, essentially, be, in negotiations with Israelis in which they have equal say over the outcome? And I think that that can be done. I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm saying that's one of the conditions in order to get to any solution that will be viable. And like connected to what Bernie said, I think on the one hand, there's also a danger in I agree 100% that it has to be a regional solution, but there's also a danger in the regional solution, because the regional solution can also be a form of sort of forcing both sides into a marriage that they're not interested in. And so, again, whatever kind of solution we come up to, it has to be achieved through the negotiation process itself. The negotiations are key. And they're also key for another reason. And I think it's connected to what Dahlia said about separation. The normal thinking, the normal framing is separate, get out of my face. But the truth is that we have to live here together. And the negotiation process also has to be one somehow of coming together and finding together ways essentially to meet the existential needs of both sides. And that's needs for control, security, dignity, welfare, livelihood. And so I would put the emphasis on the negotiation process itself and how we, design it. And not we, I think we is a kind of a funny word, and we talk about this royal we, but how Israelis and Palestinians can get together. And then the big question, of course, if we look at the political realities today in Israel and in Palestine, how do we get there? That's a big question, but I've thought about that. I talk about that, but I'll stop here.
You all three of you have talked about what you'd hope to see. What terrifies you with regard to, the prospect of marriage now of any sort feels further away than ever, and or so one could argue. So once you set aside those moments where you set aside all that the three of you have said about the need for some sort of reconciliation, in those moments where you cease to believe that is conceivable, I don't know, within our lifetimes, what what other scenarios do you imagine? In other words, what terrifies you? Because it seems to me a legitimate question at a time like this, where what it seems like is the vast majority of Israelis, even those who loathe Netanyahu, agree with his basic policy. And so putting aside your arguments for some sort of meaningful long-term reconciliation, if you were to dig underneath those hopes, what might we see?
But let me
Well,
see,
I
answer you by saying something in response to Victor. I don't think at this point negotiation would produce any result that we don't already know in advance. We've had many negotiations. Everyone knows what the issues are. There can be sort of tweaking here and there, but we know what the issues are. And as Dahlia and I have argued for many years now, when you actually look at those core issues and you try to see how to resolve them in this little small space where Israel and Palestine exist together, you know, in a space as small as Greater Los Angeles, it just doesn't make sense to talk about two states and the core issues outside of a framework of some kind of confederation or some kind of so we know what the core issues are. I think we will learn as we begin to try to implement those core the solutions to those core issues, that some form of some confederal system is going to be necessary to make it work. Having said that, I don't think the process of negotiation will lead to reconciliation or will even get to negotiations at this point. I think in this sense, Dahlia and I have both argued forcefully for the importance of having this imposed on two sides who've proven themselves over and over again incapable of getting it to a solution without some kind of regional pressure on both sides, the Arab League and the need of the Palestinians for an economic lifeline on the one hand, and Israel and the West, and Western powers, America particularly, the need for having both security, you know, having military support and also access to Western markets in the globalized way that Israel has taken advantage of them. The need is so great on both sides. Their dependence is so great that some form of forcing the issue is absolutely necessary. And I think for the first time, it's starting to become obvious to both sides, both to the larger Arab world and to the Americans, that this has to be forced, it has to be imposed. We will still pretend to have a negotiation, but it's got to come from these external actors. Now, Dahlia can say more about, you know, how public opinion is responding to Bibi and what kind of support he really has internally. But I will say that I get a strong feeling, more intuition than anything else, that almost everybody in the country now realizes that the war is lost. That this is a lost war. This is not a war that is going to have anything like the victory lap that, you know, Dayan took in 67 or Golda Meir took in 73. That this is a war that is not going to achieve its objectives. It's going to feel like a military solution, that a foreign policy based on deterrence and intimidation alone simply is not going to be possible to get the country back to any kind of normalcy. Not even get people in the north back into their homes. And that creates opportunities precisely for the kind of external imposition that I personally would welcome.
Bernie, in the absence of what you've described, what if none of that happens? If there's even more of a resolute far-right coalition governing Israel, if actually people who are principled rather than Netanyahu assume power, does any of that feel conceivable?
If you're asking me what terrifies me, the present terrifies me.
Okay.
The present terrifies me. We had a kind of dress rehearsal in May of 21, and we are seeing it again now. At some point, the West Bank has got to blow. If it blows and there's a continuing war in the north and displacement of Israelis from their homes in the north, it's almost inevitable that there will be some kind of attack in the north, which is already, I know, being at least gamed. And then you start having this, movement towards a war of ethnic cleansing like Bosnia. And in that world, it's not entirely clear what Israel is at the end of it. There's an economist in Tel Aviv University who came to the conclusion that the entire country is really held together by 300,000 people, professionals, technologists, entrepreneurs, military elites. What happens if those 300,000 people don't want to live in a little Jewish Pakistan and want to be engaged in a war of ethnic cleansing? Like, what happens in that scenario? I feel like in Jerusalem, I'm already living behind enemy lines. Where the religious Zionist world prevails. So, I'm terrified by the present, and I'm looking for some hopeful ways of talking about the future.
Delia, is it unfair to ask a policy expert the question as to what happens if everything that you'd prefer to happen doesn't happen?
Well, that's been the situation most of my life.
Right, of
So
course.
I'm not, it's completely legitimate. I will say that what terrifies me, again, I'm going to augment what Bernie said. The present is about as horrible as it can get. For many years we warned, if this isn't resolved, if there isn't progress, there's going to be something terrible, and we are now in the something terrible. But I'm sorry to say, it can get worse. And I see a very clear, set of scenarios that can be much worse than today. For one thing, nothing really has stopped. I mean, nothing really has stopped the Israeli government right now. The Israeli government is behaving like a juggernaut. I mean, Israel has behaved like a juggernaut for decades when it comes to settlements and annexation, right? And I don't just mean the de facto annexation of the West Bank. I mean de jure annexation of the Golan Heights and Jerusalem and all sorts of things that were supposed to, rally international some sort of sanction or punishment or opprobrium, at least, and maybe a little bit of opprobrium, but really nothing has stopped Israel from doing all of those things, and nothing is stopping this government now. Slight roll, sort of a rollback. Yes, they pulled a battalion out of Khan Yunis yesterday, but this has been, there's been a lot of devastation done up until now, and we still don't really see any. I mean, even though every day what comes out of the sort of talk seems to be closer to a deal, it still hasn't happened. It's been 6 months. The devastation is unprecedented, and there's no elections on the horizon, even though I'm writing a whole column about what might happen if there were. Honestly, they're not actually here yet. And so I don't see what stops this government. If nothing stops this government from doing what it wants to do, and by the way, so that of course, let me just make the point that the US, European countries so far have not stopped this government. They have talked about it. They have talked tougher. They have taken very incipient steps towards policies that might barely constrain Israel, but so far haven't actually implemented them. It's all forgive me, a sort of foreplay for an act that never, a final act that never appears in terms of taking policy measures that can actually constrain Israel's government. What worries me, what worries me is how much more physical death and destruction this war will do before it ends. What worries me is what this government will continue to do in terms of gouging out, really eviscerating the kinds of liberties that Israeli citizens have enjoyed to criticize its policy, by shutting down news media, by constraining civil society, by undermining the courts, which is, of course, the government has been continuing to do these things with full force after the war and under the cover of the war, and how much of that damage will be irreversible by the time this government does end. And I think the sum total of all of the government's efforts is to reoccupy Gaza and establish settlements. And that terrifies me because it will, forever change the geopolitics, but also because I can imagine any Palestinian left. And I know, all of my Palestinian friends and colleagues are people who are committed to, advancing a resolution to the conflict along the lines I spoke of before. These are people who faced a lot more social pressure against them than I ever have over years and decades. And I have no doubt that those who come, I'm sort of, I have to, give credit because I'm paraphrasing a friend of mine from Gaza, but I don't want to quote him because it's, it was sort of said privately. And that if someone like him sees his now destroyed, family, neighborhood, and house being taken over by settlements, that is the one thing that would turn him to violence. And I can imagine there are many more who haven't been holdouts as much as, people of his cohort. And that really terrifies me. That is probably the biggest thing that terrifies me, but it doesn't stop there because this is not only a local issue. Again, as Bernie's talked about the regional aspect, I want to talk about the international aspect. I mean, Israel has had no small part, the situation, the occupation, the conflict has had no small part in making many people around the world think that international law and the post-war international order is hypocritical, because if you have America on your side, you can do what you want. That entire concept of the, post-war international order, the rules-based order, took a death blow with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And it continues in things like Azerbaijan's assault on the Armenian enclave in September of Nagorno-Karabakh, basically saying we can resolve conflicts by force. Russia's doing it. There's, this whole international system is kind of flimsy anyway. And I think this will be the death blow if nothing in the international system, such as we know it in the most general terms, is able to both end the current war and reach conflict resolution, then I think we're going to live in a very different world. It's a world that empowers the authoritarian leaders that we're seeing on the rise. And it's a world that rewards behavior like Russia's and violations of what we once considered to be sort of a beacon of international law. And it will affect my life in my lifetime and everybody else's, and for generations to come. So that really does scare me.
Can I just, before you go to it, can I just add to this nightmare that I neglected? One is we haven't spoken about Israeli Arabs, who in any scenario of increasing polarization are pushed into a kind of decision which hitherto they have not taken. And we saw it in May of 21. Right now, because so many Israeli Arabs are appalled by Hamas and don't identify with Hamas, they've been pretty loyal. But the more you push this into extreme polarization, Israeli Arabs, who are, a fifth of our country, are going to find themselves in an impossible position and be, I think, in an increasing, danger, in a way, a mortal danger to the existence of the state. Secondly, the global economy is what Israel feeds from. If relations break, if people at Google, as we had last week, if people at Google say, I don't want to go to Israel, I don't want to be part of that, I don't want a team going and working with them. Israel is not Russia. Israel cannot live off its oil on black markets. It's got to have relations with the intelligentsia that it's alienating, the global intelligentsia that it's alienating terribly right now. And what happens to the economy? It just sinks. So anyway, go ahead, Victor. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, I would actually build on what Bernie just said now and say that actually doesn't, I mean, it doesn't terrify me because what doesn't terrify me because it may be necessary. As you pointed out, that's part of the pressure. Right now, you know our country, and you know we don't seem to be ready to be thinking very differently. We've been very lucky. We haven't paid much of a price for what we've been doing for the last 50 years, and that's it started in October. We paid a price with interest, and that seems part of the price. If that could move us out of some positions that we're in now, if it could move us, that wouldn't terrify me. I hate it, but it wouldn't terrify me. What would terrify me is that if behind that were the fact that Israel is now seen as being an illegitimate country which has no right to exist, and that's part of the discussion now, and then there's no way out. And that's what really terrifies me. Wouldn't be sanctions or the act itself. They might be useful. I mean, in the end, we might have to suffer some of that in order to get out of the situation. But if behind that is that Israel has no right to exist as an independent country, then, and what that means, of course, in any settlements, we've said it. What terrifies me immediately, I have to say, what terrifies me today, and I agree with you, Bernie, but what terrifies me today is that when I hear people saying, well, it's inevitable that we're going to go to war with the Hezbollah, it's sooner or later, we're going to have to do it. And that would mean we can't even imagine the kind of destruction that's going to mean for us. We've never experienced that. Until October 7th, I think fundamentally we felt quite invulnerable. We knew that we could be hurt, but nothing like what could happen. So that's the first thing that terrifies me. And of course, if the Iranians were to get into it, and that fear that we all had, I think, after October 7th. And the other thing that terrifies me, which, of course, I'm terrified by the idea of Israel becoming a theocracy. I mean, you hinted at that when you live behind enemy lines. And I know what you mean, and that's where we are headed to a certain extent. And I would say that we're largely headed to that because we have a very strong, powerful force that believes in that. They also believe in rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem and reinstating animal sacrifice, some of them. And that's, seems crazy, but there are people who actually, that's part of the program. And a lot of us have gone along with that for many, many years now. A lot of Israelis leaders, mostly the opposition leaders, have sort of quietly gone along with that, called managing the conflict, which has been a cover for annexation and for that. But that brings us back to before October 7th. We were involved in the protest. You mentioned it earlier, and the protest really raised the specter of civil war, and that terrifies me. And I don't, and I say I don't know way, but I can see it, because at least from where I stand, we would not want to be the kind of country that the extreme religious Zionists, and I would say only a small part of the religious really are extreme, but most seem to go along, but the extreme, religious Zionists want, And on the other hand, if we were to take power back from them in an election, knowing what happened before and knowing the way things work, I think we could expect a lot of violence from the other side. I mean, they killed Rabin, right? We've seen this, before. And so that terrifies me. And I don't, I don't know. I can see it. I can see the scenario. And I don't know exactly a way to prevent it. That's needs to be thought about.
Victor's touched on this already, but how does the world look different to the three of you after October 7th? Israel, the rest of the world, Jews elsewhere, Arabs, Hamas. And how is your sense of the reality that we live in? How has that shifted in the wake of that tragedy?
Well, I can say that one of the things that's been most interesting or most, for me, has been this whole issue of the rise of anti-Semitism again in the world. And, as an Israeli, I don't feel particularly concerned about anti-Semitism. And I feel perfectly happy to criticize my country and to say things, right? But I'm in touch with my friends, all over the world, and watching the terrible dilemma that they're facing, and how, in some ways, this whole issue of anti-Semitism coming up again, and many times I say, well, it's not. I sort of always argued against it for the years that it's often exaggerated, and all of these kinds of things. But the more I see, the more it becomes, on the one hand, something which is so complex, this line between being critical of Israel and anti-Semitism and what is really anti-Semitism, so complex, but also very real. And also you have the left and the right. I mean, it's a mess, but it's like this Pandora's box has opened up in the world, something which I never really thought we would face. And you can even imagine the fact that Israel, which was in some ways established to sort of solve the problem of anti-Semitism, could actually be the cause of a new wave of anti-Semitism in the world. I mean, I don't know if I want to say world, but it could lead to that. So that's at least one for me, one different way of saying, one thing I've seen about it. I just want to say one other thing. The other thing that terrifies me is that Trump should get reelected. I think that would be probably the nail in the coffin, for all of us. And that would be, so, and that's another thing which we've done, which we've contributed to in this conflict. So
Just feel as if there's a multitude of nails. Post October 7, how do you, what's changed in your minds?
I will jump in because I have a long list. Brittany, did you want to go first?
No, you go ahead.
Let me just preface the first point by saying that I'm looking right now at all people living in the region without so much distinguishing between Israelis and Palestinians, not to create a political equivalency or symmetry which doesn't exist, but to look at people's behavior. I never thought we could go so low. And I say that as somebody who came of age during the conflicts of Bosnia and Rwanda, and was deeply those were all consuming for me as a student. And I thought, this can't really be happening in my lifetime. And now I feel that way again. Not that there haven't been horrors in between. And right now there are, atrocities of a devastating nature going on in our, one of our neighboring countries in Sudan. And there are many other places in the world. And it's hard to explain the difference between knowing that and experiencing it of my people. And I mean my people, all of us who share the region right now. So it's not a quantification of who's doing worse, but what amazes me is the creativity of atrocities and barbarism, frankly. So it's a very hard thing to have to internalize because it's now my personal experience living in this region. The other thing is that how all-consuming this war has been. I think that I have not really lived in any other kind of mental space since October 7th. It's with us all the time. I think I'm speaking collectively, but maybe it's just me. It lurks behind every conversation, every small talk. It comes into my sleep. It bothers me in my dreams. And small talk, even at the general niceties of day-to-day life. I made a shopkeeper cry just by asking her what her general feeling was about the situation. It was kind of a joke, and she started crying, and it happens all the time, so everything around you that looks normal is a bit of a fiction right now. And I think the other thing that has changed for me, and this is not really a change, sadly, it's a bit of continuity. I think I saw the roots of this problem that I'm going to mention going back a few years already, somewhere between Trump getting elected and the corona and what it did to our mentalities. But I'm concerned about truth. Okay, I know it's very cliche to think of truth as the first victim of war, but this is worse. What I see is not just truth as a victim of war, but a sort of cult-like fetishization of selective facts as the hero of this war. People barricading themselves into a predetermined world that is scripted in advance, and then selecting and dismissing every fact that doesn't fit the worldview, and creating entire fantasies of a half world or a sliver of a world, and then unable to communicate with one another. And I don't see how we're going to reach any sort of framework for political resolution if that's the way we're thinking about it. And I think this isn't a local problem only.
Why do you think this event rendered what you're describing, which are long-standing issues, all the more visible, palpable, universal, why, why, I mean, and I don't have an answer to this question, but I understand what you're saying about the tribal nature of the way in which of this is understood. I was Rosh Chinuch B'nai Akiva. I'm still on the listservs of my former chevra, several of whom are planning for the introduction of a third temple, and and uh, and somehow this event has deepened precisely the forces that you're describing that pre-existed this event, of course. But why this?
Well, first of all, I want to say, if there's a third temple, I'm a Kohen, so it wouldn't be good for my, not going
You're
to be
in
good
good
for
shape. And I'm a Levi, so I'm with you. I'm with you.
Okay, so the two of you are absolved.
No,
Bernie,
it's not going to be good for my cholesterol. I'm telling you that right.
yeah.
I think that, uh, you know, if you ask what's changed, I mean, we meet all the time with friends here, and as Dahlia says, you know, we meet and cheer each other down. You know, we find like there's no moment when this is not on our plate. I'm in Jerusalem and I feel like, you know, there are 400,000 people like across the city who don't, you know, with whom we've worked for 30 years, normalized at some level, but at another level, we're in a kind of dangerous state of suspension of the larger picture in order not to come to conflict, not to come to violence. I think if you ask, has anything changed fundamentally in how I picture the conflict? No, I mean, I really believed, as I said before, we had a dress rehearsal of this in May of 21, and it's only just happening pretty much as a lot of us anticipated. What I think most people mean when they ask, you know, did you ever imagine October 7th could yield that? They're usually talking about things like worldwide anti-Semitism and so on, which I must confess I'm a little skeptical about. I think anti-Israeli feeling is not the same as anti-Semitism when, you know, the country has basically been an occupying power for 50 years and has deflected its activities by defaulting to descriptions of Jewish pathos and history and so on, and not being willing to confront what's going on. I think that part of the problem for American Jews now, or diaspora Jews, is that somehow, as Zionists predicted, Jewish life would be so hollowed out by generation after generation of assimilation and secularization. It would be so hollowed out. And Jews, therefore, became sort of rallying communities around Israel and, in a way, became Israel's brand managers in the United States for 40 years. And so suddenly, you know, when people turn on Israel, they're also turning on the brand managers and saying, you know, we've had to listen to these claims of yours for so long. There's a kind of backlash against it now, which is very strong. And it feels uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. I don't believe it's any more or less superficial than so many other intellectual fads and intellectual commitments that people are making in America today. But, you know, I suppose we can talk more about the diaspora in another session. I do feel that, you know, Dahlia spoke about Israelis deflecting the truth of the situation and defaulting to these pre-wired conceptions of the world. part of that is that in Israel today, this preoccupation with worldwide anti-Semitism is actually part of what allows for the deflection. My sense is that that would keep going and will keep going, except for one thing, as I said before, because for the first time, the country is facing that this is a kind of lost war. Israel hasn't really lost a war. This is a war where the aims of the war have not been met. Many of the hostages have been killed. There's this sense that, you know, you can only go so far against this particular kind of menace, and then you run up against the consequences of your own necessary overreactions and slaughter, and then face world opinion. And it just, that, you know, military solutions in this context simply don't work. And I wonder how long that original pre-wired version of the country and pre-wired version of our state, I don't mean state in the sense of political, I mean our frame of mind is going to survive this situation.
One final question before we enter into discussion. It just apropos of the conversation about the interplay between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. I think Isaiah Berlin's quip, his definition of anti-Semitism as hating Jews more than is necessary, was never more appropriate. Aside for the moment, tell me whether this observation is accurate or not. We started this discussion with all three of you, to one extent or another, rehearsing perfectly intelligible blueprints. And then once I asked about fears, the tenor of the conversation changed appreciably. And I wonder to what extent that is kind of representative of a kind of understandable bifurcation, a kind of emotional, intellectual bifurcation that now exists, with a kind of some clarity with regard to what ought to happen, and at the same time a kind of, if you will, subliminal fear of what may well happen if none of that happens. And to what extent my observation about the tenor of this conversation is indicative of that. And yeah, that's just briefly respond, and then we'll open up for discussion.
Well, I would just briefly say that it's hard to find anyone, I think today, anywhere who is truly optimistic. You know, I mean, we can think about better futures. We can think about ways of getting there. And I can talk about that. But I think in everything when you talk this bifurcation, that there is, you know, it's a dark time. I mean, Dahlia said it very, very clearly as well. So, you know, I think we do reflect that. Although part of what you asked in the original questions did make me want to think about how can we get out of here? You know, how I mean, you know, how can we move forward? And not how so much, but what are the conditions that might lead me to believe that we will get out of this? You know, so Bernie said one was that there are, you know, international pressure may not let us go to our deepest, darkest ends. You know, that might stop us. I tend to also look internally, and I mean, I looked at a number of historical analogies, and I saw two that were very interesting, actually. And of course, they're analogies, so they're not exact. But you know, the position we are, I know it's very different if you look at international, the position we are in today, and I say at least in vis-a-vis the Palestinians, and the idea that we could never reconcile with them because they want to exterminate us, which is the way I think most Israelis believe. There's no one to talk to. We were in a similar position with Egypt between 1940 and 1977. People forget this. You know, people who lived, my wife, you know, she grew up thinking Egypt was the Nazis. Sadat actually was an intelligence agent for the Nazis, and he was portrayed as a Nazis. The Germans had Germans. The Egyptians had German scientists, and Sadat appeared in the 1977 Purim parade in an SS uniform. And Sadat came, things changed, but public opinion changed. And actually, the moment we're in now, this very moment, standing outside of Rafiah, do we go in and do we? Is very similar in some ways to where we were then with the Egyptians. Huge differences, but at least something did happen. There was a sea change, totally unexpected. The other analogy that I would bring, again, as I looked at, South Africa, and this is something I say, and I'm sure Dalia has a lot to say about it as well with her knowledge of political parties, but I think internally in Israel, what we need more than anything in this country today is what I call a de Klerk moment. When de Klerk made his change, it wasn't, a lot of people say, well, it was international pressure, but actually, I've looked into this, at least economically, international pressure at that moment had not had a great influence on South Africa. South Africa was isolated politically more, but economically they weren't. And what's more, he made his statement, he made his change in 1989. In 1987, his party, the National Party, was voted in by an all-white majority, but by an all-white election, by a 70-cent majority. The other party was the Conservative Party, which is even more right-wing and more part of 22% and 8% for. So there was a 92% majority favoring apartheid, despite all of the pressure from the outside. And yet, de Klerk, and no one really knows why. I mean, I have not found a good explanation, but he stood up one day and said, "This can't go on. This can't go on." And I don't fully understand what happened. And after that, they went, in the sense of they went to a negotiation, and how that huge majority for apartheid turned into a vote, a popular vote among the all whites to end apartheid. But it happened. And tremendous differences. I won't say it's the same, but it does make you realize that things can happen, changes can occur, right? And it may be an issue of leadership. I do think that. I think that, and I'll talk about it maybe a little bit later. About I think it's on our opposition. So yes.
Now that Trump is comparing himself to Nelson Mandela, perhaps we might think about it as comparable to de Klerk. Just any final comments before we open up for discussion?
No, I think take
Shana?
some questions.
Do you want to monitor?
Yes. All right. We have a few questions, some more challenging than others. I'm just going to deliver them anonymously. Okay, the first one. Given that Golda Meir resigned shortly after the conclusion of the Yom Kippur War and the findings of the Israel Commission about that war, the description of her taking a victory lap doesn't seem to fit. Do you expect a similar commission following the conclusion of fighting in Gaza, and who has the power to either establish or prevent that process?
Let me clarify what I meant by Golda taking a victory lap. Israel had a situation where it had surrounded the Third Army. It's complicated now, but was in a position to surround the Third Army in the Sinai. And it was really Kissinger and at the time Nixon who intervened to make sure that Israel would not commit the slaughter of the Third Army. But Golda went into all negotiations thereafter, certain that Israel had won, had brought Egypt to, in effect, a surrender. It was called a ceasefire, but it was really a kind of surrender, except for how the international community, that is to say, America, intervened, which was in some cases, perhaps, some will argue what Sadat was aiming for in the first place, that he won his war just by crossing the canal, because what he did was break the deadlock which had ensued after the war of attrition. I don't want to get into this too deeply, but all I'm saying is that yes, Golda was forced to resign after the Agranat Commission came up with its findings. She was losing support, but Mapai did not. The Mapai world did not resign. Rabin and Perez, filled her shoes for the next 4 years. And I think here the change has to be more of a sea change. I think Victor will agree when he spoke before about the prospect of a potential civil war. If Israel, a cultural civil war, if Israel votes Netanyahu's government out of office, suddenly there's this split down the country between Jerusalem and the settlements, what I think of as Greater Israel, and then there's the global Israel on the coasts, and on the coast, and I don't see how if global Israel wins the next election, the world of Greater Israel then becomes a defensive crouch, and it could lead to some pretty serious violence. I do think it could lead to some serious violence if the outside imposes on Israel diplomatic pragmatism that the settlers and their fellow travelers are not going to accept.
Just add a quick point to that about the history of 1973 and the Agranat Commission. I mean, the Golda did not resign because of the commission. She resigned because the public perceived the commission as not having been severely harsh on the top leadership, and the public went out in huge numbers, unprecedented at that time. And she, basically gave in to the pressure. She said, she felt like she had to resign because of that. And so I think it's important to remember there's an important difference here. There can be an independent commission, right? Right now there's a question about whether the government will try to establish a government commission or an independent commission. There can be an independent commission, but I have very little doubt that if there were hundreds of thousands of people on the street demanding Netanyahu's resignation, he would not do it. And I don't need to predict this. All we have to do is look at 2023. This is not a government that takes responsibility or feels shame. And so I am concerned that this government will not submit to those kinds of pressures.
Yeah.
Janet?
I agree.
Oh, Victor.
No, I just say I agree completely with Dahlia. I don't think this government's going to resign. I think if we're lucky, we'll have elections in 2026. If we're lucky.
Yeah.
Janet?
Okay. Another person asks, how do we in the US best support the kind of constructive regional solution that Avishai discusses? How do we advance agendas such as that of a land for all and standing together?
Abishai?
I'm so happy you asked. Bernie, would you like to?
No, you go ahead.
Oh, I'm not sure if I have a great answer. I mean, this is basic political mobilization, right? I think those of us who are engaged in thinking about this and advocating it, whether it's through the Land for All movement or in any other format, are working on policies. We're working on talking with political elites. We're trying to the extent that we can to talk with greater public through, community and social organizations in the region. I think from the US, the important thing to do is, first of all, learn the program. I still hear too many times people saying, but why do you support one state? Or, but, there's, what about, you guys don't want a border, and these are not accurate reflections of the plan. So I think that, first of all, really learn the issues. And if you support it, then learn them well enough to answer the questions on your own, and continue to try to tell others about the ideas, be in dialogue with others in your communities and your elected leaders. I mean, I think that the important thing is for the American government to realize that this is not a pie in the sky, fantastical program. This is the only pragmatic approach, rather than, again, policies that are no longer relevant in the old hard partition of the two-state program. And I think that there's too much orthodoxy in the old two-state positions. People's identities and political persona kind of depend on it for some reason that is frankly becoming baffling to me, and I'm starting to attribute to ego or something, I don't know, something personal, because the level of people, there's a kind of shutdownness among certain people who support the older versions that is unnecessary and not helpful right now. And so I think that in the Israeli political leadership, especially those who are not related to the current government, the more they hear it from different sides, whether that's their American, counterparts and interlocutors or Jewish communities abroad, the more they'll realize it's not just a few nice people, of a grassroots movement here in the region.
Right.
Pretty-
2 points about this, by the way. If we're talking about steps and learning, how to get to a better place. First of all, the ideas of confederation were already accepted by both sides in the Jerusalem negotiation, in the creation of a common market, in the Paris agreements that led that were part of the Oslo process. In other words, there are a lot of features of the confederal model that were already in effect accepted as the inescapable implications of trying to implement solutions to the core issues. So that has to do with the long term. On the shorter term, more pragmatic things, I mean, Victor spoke about, we can't even get to asking this question until there's a change of government, and there won't be a change of government, if at all, until 2026. I think it's important to keep in mind that, we are 5 defectors away from a government falling. That is 5 members of the Likud defecting. Netanyahu has no shame. I agree with Dalia that, he's proven again and again that he'll do anything to stay in power and will keep in power. But if there are the hundreds of thousands of people who come out, it could lead to people like Gallant and others, when they see the consequences to the society as a whole. If he leaves, then you start having other people entertaining the idea, particularly if the opposition centrist parties gives them a slot to jump to, so they don't feel they're completely abandoning a political career by taking the step. I think it's not completely insane. We have our Mitch McConnells too, and we have our people who talk about one thing, and then when it comes to their political careers, they just rally to the side because they're afraid of having to go home or make a living outside of the Knesset. But I do think that we could find 5. 100,000 people could shame 5. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Bernie's the optimist
Yeah,
among us.
I want to respond a little bit differently. I mean, the question was really about, if I understood, how the American Jews or the Jews in the diaspora could somehow, that was a question, wasn't it, Steve? I understood how they can support us. Yeah. So again, I use an analogy, not a historical now, but I use an analogy. And maybe after October 10th it's a little different, but I think that Israel is addicted to power, addicted to military power. We've been addicted to the occupation. We're an addict. And power gives us use of power gives us a sense of security that's short lasting. And as Bernie pointed out, now it may even create a sense of low insecurity. But I think in terms of the Americans, in terms of of Jews in around the world, they need to think of us as a relative who's addicted. I think that's really part of the way to relate to us, and we talk about the tough love kind of thing, but not believe everything we're saying, not feeling like they should be enabling. I mean, America has been the big enabler of this addiction for years. And Israel's used, like all addicts, the issue of guilt, the Holocaust, everything else to convince all those around her to enable us to continue doing what we're doing. And so, I guess, to be very trite, but also I think this idea of tough love is really the thing. And I think that, supporting all these different solutions, which I mean, we and it's just not us, it's the Palestinians too. We have to remember that the Palestinians, if we're going to come to any kind of plan or solution like that, they have to be a full part of it. We can't just decide what we think is best and then push it for us, or push it on. But anyway, that's my sense of what the world should be towards us. our friends should be towards us. Tough love.
Any other questions, Shanna?
There's one that's a bit challenging, I think, and it's for you, Steve. And it's a kind of meta question about the event in general. And it builds off of what Victor just said. I'm going to kind of paraphrase because there are a couple questions that are along these lines. So there's a necessity
Why are these my friends?
there's a necessity for political advancement for Palestinians to be on board, right, and be a part of the conversation. And I think it was Dahlia who said that there needs to be some kind of outside mediator for these conversations. It has to be sort of forced by some sort of external parent. And I think the question is about, you started off by saying this event is not representative. It's not diverse in any way. But there are the reasons that this group is together to consider these questions together. And I think these two people who are asking questions are wondering whether these kinds of internal dialogues are contributing to this kind of intrinsic enmity between Israelis and Palestinians, or sort of further dividing the two sides, or whether we need to be forcing conversations to be happening with Israelis and Palestinians together. And what is the sort of the aim of this kind of conversation for the Stanford Jewish Studies community and beyond?
A conversation like this doesn't preclude other conversations. It just happened that more or less simultaneously, I heard from these three deeply intelligent people comments about the future, either optimistic or pessimistic. I thought it'd be interesting for the three of them to talk with one another. It doesn't preclude other people talking with one another. It doesn't preclude other conversations. We don't need to have every single conversation in one single sort of way. And so that would be my answer to those questions. Nothing precludes anything else. These happen to be people who I've talked to in one way or another. And I thought it'd be interesting for them to talk with one another. Let many conversations flourish. Thank you very much. I found this illuminating, interesting, and profoundly disturbing. And it was good to see all three of you here. Shana, thank you very much too.
Thank you all.
Thank you.